A simple rule: when IRS Relief Payment 2025 becomes a national search term, stimulus has turned into a drug. This isn't just a tax question, it's the proof of a psychological dependency built since 2008. And while most people are busy hunting for a check that doesn't exist, they're missing the real story. It's the birth of full-scale stimulus addiction. And it has already happened. Type those words into a search bar and watch what comes back. ERS Relief Payment 2025. New IRS check this year. 2025 Stimulus Update. Scroll down and you find videos with big letters screaming free money, thumbnails of checks, smiling faces, arrows pointing at dollar signs. Creators whisper about secret programs. Clips claim new relief just approved. Comment sections fill up with people asking the same question. Is this real? Is there really another check? Then you pull up the actual IRS website. No new federal stimulus. No universal relief checks. Just dry language about tax deadline extensions in disaster zones, explanations of existing credits, payment plans for people who can't pay their tax bill in full. But that's not what people are looking for. They're not hunting for footnotes and forms. They're chasing a feeling. The feeling that when things get bad enough, a check will appear. So how did we get here? How did we go from a world where government checks were unthinkable to a world where, at the first sign of trouble, millions of people open their phones and search for IRS Relief Payment 2025? To answer that, we need to stop thinking in terms of policy debates and start thinking in terms of addiction. They taught you stimulus was an emergency tool, a one-time response to a once-in-a-generation crisis, a temporary bridge over a deep, sudden drop. That's the story. The reality is simpler and uglier. Every time you use stimulus to numb the pain instead of fixing the cause, you teach a generation that pain equals payment. You train people to believe that when the system breaks, the natural response is not adjustment, not sacrifice, not restructuring, but a wire transfer. Addiction doesn't start at full strength. It builds dose by dose. Level 1, a huge crisis hits. The government sends out a check. Everyone is shocked, grateful, confused. It feels surreal. Level 2, the next crisis hits. There's another stimulus package. The word stimulus itself becomes part of everyday language, part of the expected playbook. Level 3, the crisis hasn't even arrived yet. Growth is slow, prices are high, people are stressed, and they start searching, posting, and hoping for a check that hasn't even been announced. The rumor becomes half the reality. We're not talking about centuries here. We don't need to go back to Rome for this pattern. We only need to rewind to 2008 and press play. And now, 2025, where the checks are gone, but the craving is still very much alive. Let's start at the beginning of this short, intense addiction curve. In 2008, the system snapped. Housing prices, which were supposedly on an endless escalator upwards, started falling. Mortgage-backed securities, those magical little bundles of home loans, went from safe to toxic practically overnight. Huge financial institutions wobbled, then fell. The news showed lines outside failing banks. The phrase, too big to fail, went from jargon to headline. For the average American, it felt like the floor had disappeared. Retirement accounts plunged. Home equity evaporated. Jobs vanished. You started hearing new words: bailout, TARP, credit freeze. You started wondering if your bank, your job, your house were next. At that point, policymakers had a choice. On one path, they could let a lot of bad debt actually clear. Let prices reset. Allow the pain to be sharp and honest. Tell the public that the previous level of apparent wealth was built on a bubble and that things were going to be harder for a while. On the other path, they could try to soften that pain. Use the federal balance sheet to cushion the fall. Bail out key institutions, cut rates, add liquidity, and, crucially, send a visible gesture to households that help was on the way. They chose the second path. In early 2008, the Economic Stimulus Act was signed into law. Among its components was something that, at the time, felt strange and new to many people: tax rebate checks, mailed directly to most taxpayers. For millions of Americans, this was the first time they had seen money arrive from Washington because of a macroeconomic crisis. Not a tax refund they'd calculated, not a Social Security payment earned over decades. A one-off, broad-based injection of cash, $300, $600, maybe a bit more depending on your situation. Enough to help with bills, not enough to change your life. But that's not the point. The point is the connection that got wired. The system is breaking. The government sends me money. That first check wasn't just money, it was a signal. It told people, when things get bad enough, we will step in directly. We will not only help banks and markets, we will put your name on a payment and mail it to your house. That is the first hit. Small, justified, not obviously dangerous. But it established something you cannot unsee once you've seen it. Crisis and check are now linked. Then came 2009. The 2008 check had landed. But the pain didn't magically disappear. Unemployment stayed high, foreclosures continued, businesses were still shutting down. The financial system, while propped up, was fragile and mistrusted. The shock wasn't over. The patient was still on the table. Now comes the next dose. In early 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act is passed. The ARRA, often just called the stimulus package. This one is bigger, more complex. It's not just checks, it's a full menu. Government spending on infrastructure, education, energy projects, extended unemployment benefits, aid to state governments, tax credits. A broad, aggressive attempt to jolt the economy back to life. The language around it is revealing. We will stimulate demand. We will jumpstart growth. We will spend our way out of recession. The word stimulus starts to dominate news segments. It crawls across TV chyrons. It becomes part of the vocabulary of everyday people trying to understand what's happening. The first hit in 2008 was a check in the mailbox. The second hit in 2009 is an entire policy style. From this point forward, the idea that Washington should respond to economic weakness with big, visible programs moves from controversial experiment to standard operating procedure. You no longer talk about recessions without talking about stimulus. You no longer talk about stabilizing the system without assuming some new package is coming. The dosage is going up, the body is adjusting. Then, for a while, the world calms down, or at least looks calmer on the surface. The next decade brings slow recovery. Markets recover, then soar, tech stocks boom, unemployment falls. For many people, it feels like 2008 was a nightmare that's finally receding into the rearview mirror. But the pattern is still there, waiting. And then 2020 arrives, not with a financial glitch, not with a housing bubble collapse, with something much more blunt, a virus. 1 month, the economy is running. The next month, it slams into a wall. Flights canceled, streets empty, restaurants, theaters, offices shut. Tens of millions of people go from "I have a job" to "my employer just closed" in a matter of weeks. The drop isn't gradual, it's like someone flipped the off switch on huge chunks of daily life. This isn't just a normal recession. You can't just lower rates and hope people spend more if they aren't allowed to go outside. So policymakers reach for the biggest lever they have, direct stimulus on a scale that makes 2008 look tiny. Over 2020 and 2021, the United States rolls out not one, not two, but 3 rounds of stimulus checks. Money wired directly into bank accounts or sent as physical checks. For some households, the total adds up to thousands of dollars. At the same time, enhanced unemployment benefits pour out even more money. Some people, at least temporarily, receive more from being unemployed than from working their old jobs. Programs like PPP send funds to businesses to keep them afloat. Loan payments are paused, evictions are slowed or halted. If 2008 was a small shot, 2020 is a full-on IV drip. This time, stimulus isn't a weird, one-off experience. It becomes a lifestyle, at least for a moment. People make memes about stimmies. They joke on social media about what they'll buy when the next round hits. Entire trading frenzies ignite as stimulus money flows into stock and crypto markets. The day a check lands becomes an event, and deep under all the memes and jokes, a new narrative takes root. If something truly big goes wrong, the government will pay me to stay home. Work stops, money continues, reality shuts down, deposits still show up. This is the moment stimulus fully stops being policy and becomes something more intimate, a personal experience, repeated, expected, almost normalized. It's not an annual tradition, but it's no longer unthinkable. You've now seen multiple rounds in rapid succession. The dosage is now massive, the receptors in the public mind are fully active. And then, just as suddenly as the checks started, they stop. Programs expire, emergency measures are phased out. The official message shifts from "we'll support you through the crisis" to "we're returning to normal." But what is normal now? Because during those years, something else happened. Prices moved. All that money, plus supply chain shocks, plus disruptions, led to the highest inflation most people had seen in their adult lives. Rent, food, gas, utilities. Everything got more expensive. If you spent your stimulus checks, that money felt great when it arrived. But the new baseline of living costs didn't go back down when the last check cleared. Wages didn't instantly jump to match. Savings lost purchasing power. People on fixed incomes or in low-wage jobs started feeling squeezed. So by the time you reach 2025, here's the picture. No new federal stimulus checks. High prices that never fully retreated. Interest rates higher than the era of free money. Credit card balances at record levels. A lot of households one emergency away from serious trouble. And a memory, very fresh, of what it felt like when checks showed up. Now the addiction shows itself in a new form. Because even though Washington hasn't passed a new universal stimulus, the public behavior says something loud and clear. They are still looking for it, literally in their search bars. That's where IRS Relief Payment 2025 comes in. Those 4 words aren't just a query, they're an X-ray of the national mindset. On the policy side, the IRS is talking about boring things, tax extensions for people hit by hurricanes, wildfires, or other disasters. Guidance on payment plans for overdue taxes, the same types of relief the agency has always offered in specific circumstances. On the rumor side, the internet is talking about something completely different. A new round of broad relief, a secret pot of money, a hidden program you can tap if you just watch the right video and fill in the right form. You have a gap between reality and expectation big enough to drive a truck through. Reality says there is no new federal, everyone gets a check stimulus. Expectation says there must be something. Because there was last time. Because in 2008 there was a check. Because in 2020 there were checks. Because that's what happens in a crisis now, right? So people search, they click, they share. Creators make content around those searches because that's where the eyeballs are. IRS Relief 2025 becomes both a keyword and a symptom. This is what level 3 of addiction looks like. The supply is gone. The craving is still there. In 2008, the check surprised people. In 2020, they anticipated the next one. By 2025, some are hunting for a check that doesn't exist yet, hoping that if they just look hard enough, it will materialize. The drug is no longer just money, it's the expectation of money, and that is much harder to unwind. Zoom out now. Forget the partisan talking points. Forget whether you personally liked the stimulus or hated it. Think like a historian looking at a cycle. What are the long-term costs of building stimulus addiction? Start with the simplest. Debt. Every round of crisis spending, every check, every emergency program that isn't funded by actual surplus has to land somewhere. If it doesn't land on taxes today, it lands on debt tomorrow. Year after year, the number creeps higher, then jumps, then creeps again. At near zero interest rates, that felt abstract. At higher interest rates, it becomes real. Servicing the debt, the interest alone, starts to consume a bigger slice of the budget. That means less room for everything else or more borrowing on top of borrowing. Then there's inflation. In 2020 and 2021, you had a unique mix. Money creation, supply shocks, and constrained output. Prices surged. When that happens, the line between helping and hurting gets blurry. If you're heavily indebted and get a check, that's huge short-term relief. If you're living on savings or a fixed income, rising prices eat you alive. Stimulus doesn't just give, it also redistributes, sometimes deliberately, often chaotically. Then there's something harder to measure, but more important, trust in the money itself. When people watch their leaders casually approve trillions in new programs, year after year, crisis after crisis, when they hear the phrase, "we'll do whatever it takes," repeated like a mantra, when they see that the solution to almost every problem is more, never less. They may not be able to explain monetary theory, but they feel something shift. The money no longer feels like a firm measuring stick. It feels like a lever. If the lever can always be pulled to make more, the question in the back of everyone's mind becomes, how long until this stops working? Now combine that with politics. Voters have learned a simple pattern. If there's enough pain, there will be a check. Politicians have learned another. If I don't offer relief, I lose votes. If my opponent promises more, I look cruel. That is how stimulus addiction locks in. Neither side has an incentive to be the adult in the room, to say, this time we're not going to mail money, this time we will take the hit. This time, restructuring is more important than relief. The easiest thing for the short term is always to reach for the syringe again. More spending, more support, more money now, consequences later. Until later shows up. So where are we really in this curve? Let's trace the arc one more time. In 2008, a huge financial crisis led to a small but powerful psychological event, a check in the mailbox when the system broke. That was the first hit. You can't take that experience away. In 2009, a follow-up package entrenched the idea that recessions and stimulus are now married. It wrote stimulus into the script of how America deals with trouble. That was the habit forming. In 2020 and 2021, the pandemic took stimulus to an entirely new level. Multiple checks, expanded benefits, and wide-reaching programs. A large part of the population learned through direct experience that reality can stop and money will still show up. That was the full dosage. In 2025, with no new nationwide checks, you'd think the story might be over. But the search trends tell you something different. People still type IRS relief payment 2025. They still watch videos about checks that aren't coming. They still hope on some level that crisis equals cash. That's the craving stage. A healthy economy treats stimulus like rare medicine, powerful, dangerous if overused, and reserved for when there truly is no other choice. An addicted economy treats stimulus like oxygen, always assumed, always necessary, always the first demand when something hurts. So when you see IRS relief payment 2025 climbing the charts, you're not just looking at tax confusion. You're looking at a mirror reflecting a culture that has quietly shifted from one that expected to endure recessions to one that expects to be compensated for them. The uncomfortable question isn't, will there be another check? The uncomfortable question is, what happens to a system that has trained its people to expect money every time reality hurts? When the math finally says, no more? What happens when the drug stops working? When new stimulus triggers more inflation than relief, more mistrust than confidence? When the crisis is not just financial, but one of belief? Every addiction has 3 stages: the first high, the escalating dose, and the moment you realize you can't feel normal without it. We've had the first high, we've had the escalation. If IRS relief payment 2025 is the question everyone is silently asking, maybe the real question is this: are we already in the stage where stimulus isn't just something the government does, it's something a whole nation can't imagine living without?